All right, we're going to start our part two. Yesterday, or Monday, I should say, we learned about the sine and the cosine graph. And we learned that we need an amplitude and a period. Amplitude tells us the height of the graph, how high it goes above the x-axis, and how low it goes below the x-axis. The period tells us how long one rotation would be in radians. Radians, our x-axis is always going to be in radians. The y-axis is our amplitude, our height. All right, so let's find the amplitude in this graph. It's always going to be the absolute value of the coefficient of our trig function. What's in front of my trig function is -3. So my amplitude is actually a 3. So what I'm going to do is label 1, 2, messed up, hold on. 1, 2, 3, like that. I'll skip every one line, so that'll be a half, and then 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3. And I'll do the same thing below. -1, -2, -3. Now the period is 2 pi divided by whatever b is. B was the coefficient of which one? The x. That's right, the coefficient of the x. Just find the x and see what's directly in front of x. So in this case, it's going to be 2 pi divided by 2 pi. That's just 1. These both cancel out. You get a 1. So our amplitude, our period is 1. 1 radian. Normally, you have a pi down here, and you'd have pi radians, which is 3.14 radians. In this case, I only have 1 radian. That means that from one starting point to the next starting point would have a distance of 1 radian. All right, so 1 radian is going to be a period. So what I'm going to do on this one, instead of labeling it by pi's, I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, and I'm also going to do -1, -2. I'm going to shift this over. -1, -2, maybe even a -3 if I want to. Now, the reason I did the negatives is because I happened to notice this right here was a -3. And negatives tend to switch our graph around. I also noticed that this represents a horizontal shift. So it's going to shift right or left. So if I shift to the right, I'll be over in this area. If I shift to the left, I'll be over in this area. So I'm just going to label both sides so I can see where my graph might end up. Now normally I would start at 0. But this has a shift. So I got to take the 2 pi x plus 4 pi and find out what would make it become a 0. What could I put in for x that would make this whole thing equal 0 so I can see where I'm going to start my graph? Okay, you're right, it is -2 because you're going to subtract 4 pi on both sides. Those cancel out. You get 2 pi x equals -4 pi. Divide by 2 pi on both sides. And that way the 2 pi's will cancel out. And here the pi's are going to cancel out there. So all you have is a -4 divided by a -2, or +2, which is a -2. So normally I would start at 0. But where am I going to really start today? -2. So I'm going to go over here to -2. And I'm going to say to myself, what shape is this curve? Is it a bow tie or a V? It's a V, because it's cosine. The next thing I have to ask myself, is it a positive or a negative graph? And I'm looking here, it's a negative. Normally I would start at the top. Cosines always start at the maximum, right? But what happens when it's a negative? It's going to start at the bottom. So we're going to go over to -2 and go down to -3. If you plugged in a -2 right here, you're going to get a -3 to come out. Let me prove it to you. Let me put a little teeny -2 right there. Okay, what's 2 pi times -2? -4 pi plus +4 pi. 0. Cosine of 0 is 1. And what's 1 times -3? -3. There's my point down here at the bottom. You plug in a -2, you're going to get out a -3. So that's 1 point that would be on this graph right here. Now it's going to start at a minimum and it's going to end at a minimum. So -1 is also going to be a -3. It always starts and ends at the same place. Because you remember that normally you would see a V-shaped curve where it would start and it would stop at the top. But with this negative, it's going to start and stop at the bottom. It's going to be an upside down graph because this negative made it upside down. So I'm going to start here and I'm going to end here. Halfway between those two is going to be my maximum value. Because you've got your V, it's got to come all the way down to this bottom or it's going to go all the way up to this top right here. So you split these two in half and you get your other side. If you split these two in half, you're going to get your intercept. So this is a very crunched graph. It's a very compact graph. It's only between 1 radian where we get one full curve. So when I draw this curve in there, it's going to be pretty tight graph. It'll look like that. Upside down V-shaped curve because it was a negative. That means between -2 and -1 was one full rotation on my graph. If I wanted to do another one, the y-axis would be my other minimum. Halfway between that would be another maximum. These would be my two more intercepts, and I could draw another curve in there. And that would be a second upside down. That'd be 2 rotations around the circle. So that is a very compact graph, and it was shifted to the left because this was a plus, and it's made me start at -2. So if I was to ask you 2 pi x plus 4 pi, if I was to ask you what would make it equal 2 pi, remember we usually start at 0 and we usually end at 2 pi. What would make this be 2 pi? Where did we end our graph? Where did we end my first curve? At -1. So if I solve this, I bet I get -1. So if you do a -4 pi, cross cancel that, you get 2 pi x equals -2 pi. Divide by 2 pi, and yes, you get -1. So we knew that this had to be 1 unit apart because my period was 1. The period was 1, so I'm going to start and end at a space that's 1 unit apart from each other. So that's a very compact graph here. Between 1 radian is one whole curve. And it's shifted over to the left. Now we could continue our curve as many times as we want to, but we only ask for 2 rotations. This one right here? Because we usually start our graphs at 0. And we usually end at 1 time around the circle. So this is our 0 point, that's our 1 time around the circle. That's where we would usually start and stop. Except when there's a shift or a number in front, we got to figure out where we'd actually start and stop. Now the next 2 are really easy ones. The next 2 don't even have a shift or anything. Yeah. Usually it'll say make 2 rotations. And I'm not going to mark it wrong if you just do 1 rotation to get that one right. I'll probably be fine with that. But normally it'll say just make 2 full rotations. Okay, so what I did was, you got to find your starting and your ending point. Halfway between those 2 would be your other extreme point. So if these are both minimums, then halfway between the 2 and the 1, this line right here, has to be your maximum. But you need to get from your maximum down to your minimum, so you got to have an intercept somewhere. And it's got to be between those 2. Let's look at this one. This one's even quicker, shorter. It's going to be a really fast little curve. Let's find our amplitude and our period. Amplitude would be what on this graph? 3. Absolute value of 3 is 3. Period is 2 pi divided by 2, because that's in front of our x, so that's just pi. So I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3. I'm going to go down -1, -2, -3. I'm going to go over to pi, and I'm going to go over 4 spots and put a pi. That means this will be 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. So 2/4 would actually be a half. So I'm going to put pi over 2 there. Now what kind of curve do I have here? The sine curve. What does it look like? The bow tie, right? We call it the bow tie. That means it starts at 0 and it ends at 0. If you can remember that bow tie starts and ends at 0, it'll really help. And what do I put halfway between those two? Another 0. In a sine curve, you've got 3 of them. It's cosine curve, you've only got 2 intercepts. So I start at 0, I end at 0, halfway between them I put 0. What do I put halfway between the first 2 intercepts? A maximum value. Halfway between the last 2 intercepts, a minimum value. There's your sine curve. That's how fast these graphs can go if you've got your amplitude and your period. And if you know the shape of your graph, you can draw them really quick. Especially if there's no shift or anything like that. You don't have to solve anything. You just draw in your 5 points. You just need the 5 points to get your curve. So that was the second one on your back side. Now let's get to the third one. There's no shift in that one either. We are going to add one more. I'll show you what that one is in a minute. Let me move to the next one. Again, we need to find our A and we need to find our P. Amplitude of this graph, absolute value of a half is a half. So I would go up a half and I would go down a half. My period of this graph is going to be 2 pi divided by what? 4. That means I'm taking everything that I plug into my x and I'm multiplying it by 4. What would this period become when we reduce this? Pi over 2. A pretty small period. From 0 to pi over 2, plugging those numbers into your x would actually represent one time around your chart. So I'm gonna put pi over 2 at the 4th line. That means the halfway point would actually be pi over 4. This would be 1/8. This would be 3/8. So I'm just going to leave it in 8 this time, just to make it spread out a little bit more so you can see the curve. What kind of curve do I have here? It says sine. Bow tie. So I start at 0, I end at 0, and my middle point is also 0. And what do I know about between the first 2? Since it's a positive graph, what am I going to do between the first 2? Go to a maximum. Second 2, I'm going to go to my minimum. If that was a negative graph, you would go to a minimum first, then you would do your maximum. And we would just draw in our curve. So there's your bow tie. That's one rotation. I could do another rotation. If it says make 2 rotations, then I would put another line over here. I'd make 2 more intercepts. I'd make another maximum. I'd make another minimum. And I would draw in my second curve. There's 2 rotations. You could draw 1 rotation, you could draw 2 rotations. It should tell you in the directions what they were looking for. Now the last one, I didn't actually put on the note sheet, so you're going to want to draw yourself a little X and Y axis. And you've got some room in the bottom right corner to do that, so draw a little X and Y axis. And we're going to use Y equals 2 plus, I want to make sure I get it right here, 2 plus 3 cosine of 2x. We want to graph this little equation onto our X and Y axis. Okay, so let's first find our A and our P, because that's our starting point. Find the amplitude, find the period. Amplitude is absolute value of 3, which is 3. Always the coefficient of the trig function. Always. Doesn't matter about this 2 out here in front. All that matters is this 3 right here is in front of your cosine. So that's your amplitude. That's how high above the origin and how below the x-axis that we would go. Now the period is 2 pi divided by whatever's in front of x. 2. There's a 2 in front of x. So we're going to put a 2 there. and that means your period is pi. So that means I'm going to start at 0 and I'm going to end at pi. So I'm going to go over 4 spots and put a pi there. That means this will be pi over 2. So I start at 0, I end at pi. Now, that 2 out in front, that's what I got to figure out what that's going to do to my graph. So what I want to do is I'm going to make a little x and y chart. And I'm going to plug in a 0 since that's the easiest number to plug in. Now let's just see what this 2 does to my graph. So I'm going to take right here, I'm going to put a little 0 underneath that x. Now let's see what happens. What is 2 times 0? 0. Do you remember what the cosine of 0 was on your chart? 1. It was 1. Remember, cosine always starts at a maximum. So the cosine of 0 is 1. What's 1 times 3? 3. So normally I would put a 0 in and I'd get a 3 out. But what are they doing here now? Adding 2. So what's 3 plus 2 more? 5. So your 1 point on your graph is this coordinate right there. 0, 5. So over 0, I'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll put it right there. So does that mean it goes 5 above the x-axis and 5 below? No, because what does my amplitude tell me? 3. So I need to go down 3 units. This is my new x-axis. Because my amplitude tells me it's got to be 3. My height of my graph has got to be 3. So I got to go 3 above and 3 below this new x-axis. I shifted it up 2 because this right here is a vertical shift. That's telling me to go up 2 units to get a new x-axis. Now you're going to go up 3 and down 3 from that point. Now what kind of curve is it? I see cosine there. It's the V. So it means it starts at a maximum and ends at a maximum. So if you go to pi, you're going to go up to 5. Starts and ends at a maximum. Why did I add 3 here? The reason is because I plugged in a 0 and a 5 came out. So that's got to be on my graph. So this point is on my graph. Now my amplitude is 3, is going to go down 3 to that because that's a maximum right here. This represents a max value. So if I want to find my x-axis, I go down 3 units because that's my amplitude. I'll go up from there because that's already a max. Now halfway between these two maximums would be my minimum value. Does that mean it's down 5? No, from this point we're going to go down 3 units. It's going to be right at 1. Or negative 1, I mean. That is going to be at negative 1. So, and then halfway between those two would be an intercept on my dotted line. So I'm going to draw in this curve right there. That's going to be the graph of that. That's 1 rotation for this equation. Now let me show you what it would have looked like had there been no 2 plus right here. If this 2 plus was not there. My maximum would have been 3 and 3 over here. My minimum would have been negative 3. And these would have been my 2 intercepts on the x-axis. This would have been my curve. Do you see what happened from the black one up to the red one? We vertically shifted it up 2 units. Everything got moved up 2 units. This whole graph was just moved up and it became the red graph. Okay, so that's what that 2 plus does in front. It vertically moves it up. What if it was negative 2 plus? Then it would shift it down. So that's the vertical shift, is when you have something in front. All right, that was part 2 for your graph.